The rain had been falling for 3 days. It was a cold, relentless sheet of grey that turned the dirt road outside the Thorn Ranch into a river of mud. And for 3 days, she had been sitting there. She sat on a small, worn satchel just beyond the formidable wooden gate, its iron hinges already blooming with rust. She did not huddle or shiver, though the dampness must have sunk deep into her bones. She did not beg. She did not call out. She simply sat, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the house that stood like a stone fortress on the rise a quarter-mile away. Inside that house, Elias Thorne watched her. He stood by the window of his study, a place that smelled of old leather and cold ash, and watched the woman become a part of the miserable landscape. On the first day, he had dismissed her as a drifter, a beggar who would soon be driven off by the weather. He had work to do, fences to mend, accounts to settle, 2 sons who ran wild as coyotes now that Mrs. Gable, their 3rd housekeeper in a year, had finally fled. On the second day, a grim annoyance took root. His ranch hands, men not given to gossip, spoke of her in hushed tones in the barn. They called her the gate watcher. They wondered at her stillness, her refusal to ask for anything. Elias felt their unspoken questions like a weight on his own shoulders. He was the master of this land. This was his problem to solve. He scowled at her silhouette, a stubborn blot against the grey dawn, and returned to his ledgers. The numbers blurred. On the 3rd day, the annoyance had curdled into something else, something unsettling. Her persistence was unnatural. It was a silent accusation, though of what, he could not say. His sons, Leo and Sam, had noticed her too. They'd stood on the porch, their faces pressed to the railing, pointing, "Is she a ghost, Pa?" Sam, the younger one, had asked, his voice small. Elias had not answered. Now, as the afternoon light began to fail, swallowed by another wave of rain, he could stand it no longer. This silent siege had to end. He pulled on his heavy oilskin coat, the fabric stiff and cold, and strode from the house, his boots sinking into the sodden earth. He did not bother with a horse. He wanted the walk, the mud, the cold spray on his face, to fortify the anger he needed to send her away. He was a hard man. The land had made him that way. Loss had sealed it. He did not have room for charity, not the kind that sat at his gate with the patience of a stone. The walk felt longer than usual. The gate loomed, a barrier between his world and whatever desperation had washed this woman to its edge. She heard his approach. He saw the slight turn of her head, but she did not stand. She simply waited, her hands folded in the lap of her plain, dark dress. He reached the gate, his hand resting on the cold, wet wood. He prepared the words. Harsh, final words. "Go, there is nothing for you here." He swung the heavy gate open. It groaned in protest. And he froze. He had expected a face etched with beggary, with the vacant desperation of the hopeless. He saw none of that. Her face was plain, her skin weathered by sun and hardship. There were lines of sorrow around her mouth and eyes, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were a clear, steady grey, and they held no plea. They held a quiet, unbreakable dignity. They held the same light of grim determination he had once seen in his wife, Sarah, when she'd faced down a blizzard to save a newborn calf. He saw a woman who was not broken, but bent to the very edge of breaking and refusing to snap. His prepared words died in his throat. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat, a steady, rhythmic beat in the sudden, profound silence. He looked from her impossibly steady eyes to the worn satchel she sat upon, the only thing she seemed to possess in the world. He saw her hands, chapped and red from the cold, but clean. He saw the proud set of her shoulders. She was not asking. She was not crying. She was just there. The anger he had nurtured for 3 days evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unfamiliar. "You have a name?" he asked. The words were clipped, harsher than he intended. "Clara," she said. Her voice was low and hoarse from disuse, like dry wood splitting. He nodded slowly, his mind racing. He thought of the cold hearth in his home. He thought of his sons, their shirts perpetually torn, their hair uncombed, their hearts running wild and untended. He thought of the crushing silence that filled the halls after they fell into an exhausted sleep. He needed help. He knew it. But this was not the help he would have sought. "I need a mother for my sons," he heard himself say, the words blunt, stripped of all sentiment. "A woman to run my house. You need shelter." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. A transaction. Clara looked up at him, her grey eyes searching his face. She saw the hardness there, the deep lines of grief he thought he hid so well. She saw a man walled off from the world, a man offering a cage in exchange for warmth. But a cage with a roof was better than a roadside in the rain. She gave a single, slow nod. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice still rough. She rose, her movements stiff from the cold. She was taller than he'd expected, and thinner. The wind pressed the wet fabric of her dress against her frame, revealing a stark fragility he had not seen when she was seated. "There will be no affection in this," he stated, feeling a strange need to draw the lines clearly, to protect the frozen ground around his heart. "It is an arrangement. You will have a room, food, and my protection. In return, you will care for my sons and this house as its mistress." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I understand," she said. Then she added, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "I will care for your children as if they were my own. I will manage your home with respect. But I will be a partner in its keeping, not a servant." Elias stared at her for a long moment. He saw the pride flare in her eyes, a tiny defiant spark in the twilight. He respected it. He respected the strength it took to set a condition when she had nothing. He gave a curt nod. "Come." He turned and walked back toward the house, not looking back to see if she followed. He did not need to. He could hear the soft, squelching sound of her worn shoes in the mud behind him, a quiet, steady rhythm that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The Thorn house was as imposing from the inside as it was from out. The ceilings were high, the furniture dark and heavy, but a layer of dust coated every surface, and the air held a deep, chilling cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a home without a heart. Clara stood in the entryway, her small satchel clutched in her hand, water pooling around her feet on the wooden floor. She felt the silence of the place pressing in on her. It was a house, haunted by an absence. Two small faces peered at her from the top of the grand staircase. Two pairs of suspicious eyes, dark like their father's. The older one, perhaps 10, had a defiant scowl. The younger, no more than 7, hid mostly behind his brother, his thumb stuck in his mouth. "Leo, Sam," Elias's voice boomed, startling them. "Come down." They descended slowly, their boots thudding on the steps, their eyes never leaving Clara. They stopped a few feet away, a united front of hostility. "This is Clara," Elias said. "She will be, staying here." He fumbled with the description, the word mother feeling like a betrayal on his tongue. "She will be looking after you." Leo, the older boy, took a step forward. His eyes were narrowed. "We don't need looking after." His voice was a small echo of his father's hard tone. He then looked Clara up and down, his gaze openly contemptuous. "And we don't want her." Before anyone could react, he scooped a handful of mud from his own boot and flung it. It struck the front of Clara's dress with a wet smack, a dark stain spreading across the worn grey fabric. Sam giggled, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Elias's face darkened with rage. He took a step toward his son, his hand raised. "Leo." "No." Clara's voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. Elias stopped, his hand still in the air. Clara did not look at the stain. She did not look at Elias. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the two boys. She did not scold or cry out. She simply held Leo's furious stare until his own gaze faltered and fell to the floor. Then she spoke, her voice even. "That was a waste of good mud," she said calmly. "The north wall of the smokehouse has a crack in it. This could have been used to patch it before the winter damp gets in." She knelt, her knees protesting the cold, and picked up her satchel. She walked past the stunned boys and the frozen man, leaving a trail of muddy water behind her, and headed toward the kitchen, which she found by instinct. From the study doorway, Elias watched her go. He watched his sons, who stood rooted to the spot, their defiance crumbling into confusion. He had expected tears or anger, a demand for him to punish his son. He had not expected practicality. He had not expected a quiet strength that absorbed the insult and turned it into a lesson about work. He lowered his hand, a strange feeling moving through his chest. It felt like respect. The days that followed were a quiet battle. Clara moved through the house with a tireless, methodical grace. She did not try to change things overnight. She simply began to mend the frayed edges of their lives. She started in the kitchen, a room that had been abandoned to grease and disorder. She scrubbed it clean, and soon the scent of baking bread began to push back against the cold smell of dust and neglect. The boys tested her relentlessly. They hid her sewing needles. They put a frog in her bed. They tracked mud across her freshly mopped floors. Each time her reaction was the same, calm, quiet, and utterly unflappable. She did not punish. She did not raise her voice. She simply gave them a task that was a direct consequence of their actions. When they tracked in mud, she handed them rags and a bucket. "A floor is a floor," she said. "It is meant to be walked on. But a home is a home. It is meant to be cared for. You will help me care for it." Elias observed it all from a distance. He saw the subtle shifts. He saw the way Sam had begun to watch her, his thumb less frequently in his mouth. He saw the way Leo's scowl was now laced with a grudging curiosity. They had never had a woman in their lives who did not either coddle them or scream at them. Clara did neither. She simply was, a calm, steady presence. He found himself watching her too. He watched her hands, surprisingly deft as she mended a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and even. He watched her in the garden, coaxing life from the neglected soil. He noticed the way she would pause and close her eyes when a rare beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, as if drinking it in. He was a man who valued strength, and he was beginning to see that Clara's strength was of a different kind than his own. His was the strength of a rock, unmoving and hard. Hers was the strength of water, which yields and flows, but in the end can wear down stone. One evening, he came in late from the barns, weary to his bones. The house was quiet. He expected to find a cold dinner left on the stove. Instead, he found Clara sitting by the hearth in the main room, a book open in her lap. A fire blazed in the fireplace, the first real fire he'd seen there in over 2 years. It cast a warm, flickering glow on the walls, chasing the shadows into the corners. A plate of stew and fresh bread sat warming on the hearth. She looked up as he entered. "I thought you might be cold," she said simply. He stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floor, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. He did not say thank you. The words were too foreign, too soft. He just nodded, took the plate, and sat in the chair opposite her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared space, a small truce in the quiet war of their arrangement. He looked at her across the flickering light. Her face was softened by the firelight, the weary lines less pronounced. He realized he did not know the first thing about her. He did not know where she came from, or what sorrow had driven her to his gate. "The boys," he said, breaking the quiet. "They are difficult." Clara marked her page and closed her book. "They are grieving," she corrected gently. "Grief in a child often looks like anger. They are testing the world to see if it is still a safe place." Elias had never thought of it that way. He had only seen their wildness as a problem to be tamed, a reflection of his own failure. He had never considered the fear that lay beneath it. "Their mother," he began, but the words caught in his throat. He never spoke of Sarah. Clara waited. She did not press. She simply sat, her hands folded, offering him the space to speak if he chose. Her patience was a gift. He finally shook his head, unable to continue. But something had shifted. In that small, firelit room, a crack had appeared in the wall he had built around himself. He was looking at this plain, quiet woman, and he was seeing not just a solution to his problems, but a person with a wisdom that both unnerved and intrigued him. Later that night, a storm broke with a vengeance. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning split the sky. A piercing scream echoed from upstairs. Elias was halfway out of his chair before he realized it was Sam. Another nightmare. He started for the stairs, his heart heavy with the familiar ritual of trying to comfort a child who only wanted a mother he could not have. But he stopped. Clara was already there, gliding up the stairs, a single candle in her hand. He retreated into the shadows of the hall and watched. He saw her enter the boys' room. He heard Sam's terrified sobs. He heard Leo's sleepy, irritated grumbling. He crept closer, standing just outside the door, hidden in the darkness. He expected her to offer platitudes, to say it was just a dream, but she did not. He heard her soft voice. "Tell me about the dream, Sam." There was a choked sob, then Sam's small voice trembling. "It was dark, and I was alone. I called for Mama, but she didn't come." Elias's own throat tightened. "I know that dark," Clara said softly. "I have been there too. It is a lonely place." She did not say your mama is gone. She did not lie and say it would be all right. She simply validated his fear. "But you are not alone now. Leo is here. And I am here." There was a long silence, broken only by the storm outside. "Will you sing?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Mama used to sing." Elias braced himself for a refusal, for an awkward explanation. Instead, he heard Clara begin to hum. It was not a real song, just a low, soothing melody, a wordless lullaby that was both mournful and full of peace. It was the sound of quiet strength, of shared sorrow. Slowly, Sam's sobs subsided. In the long silence that followed, Elias heard Leo's voice, rough with sleep but stripped of its usual hostility. "Don't stop." Clara continued to hum. Elias stood in the darkness of the hallway, a solitary ghost in his own home, and listened as this strange, quiet woman soothed the two halves of his broken heart. He felt a profound and painful loosening in his chest, as if a band of iron that had been squeezing his ribs for 2 years had suddenly given way. He retreated to his study before she could see him, and poured himself a whiskey he did not drink. He looked out at the storm-lashed prairie. He had brought this woman into his home as a convenience, a tool to restore order. But she was not a tool. She was a quiet force, slowly and patiently bringing warmth to the cold corners of his house and of his life. The thought was terrifying, and for the first time in a very long time, it was also hopeful. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn as always. He went to the kitchen, he poured a cup of milk, heated it on the stove, and left it on the small table outside Clara's room. He did it without thinking, an instinct he did not examine. When he returned from the barn hours later, he found a single, perfectly baked biscuit sitting on the corner of his desk. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The first snow came early that year, a thick white blanket that isolated the ranch completely. The world shrank to the boundaries of their fences. Inside the house, however, a fragile warmth was growing. Clara had established a rhythm, a routine that was as steady and dependable as the sunrise. The boys, won over by her unshakable calm and the undeniable comfort of warm meals and mended clothes, had ceased their open rebellion. Leo still held a kernel of resentment, a fierce loyalty to the memory of his mother. But he no longer challenged Clara directly. Sam, however, had begun to follow her like a shadow, his small hand often finding its way into hers as she worked. Elias found himself speaking more, not about anything of substance, but small things. Observations about the weather, instructions for the ranch hands, comments on the livestock. It was a start. He would find her mending by the fire in the evenings, and would sit with his ledgers, the comfortable silence a new language they were both learning. It was during one of these quiet evenings that the world intruded. The sound of a horse and buggy struggling through the snow brought them all to the window. Elias's body went rigid. He recognized the buggy. "It's Martha," he said, his voice flat and hard. Clara looked at him, questioning. "My sister-in-law," he clarified, the words tasting like ash. "Sarah's sister." Martha burst into the house without knocking, a whirlwind of expensive wool, fake sympathy and cloying perfume. She was a handsome woman, but her face was pinched with a perpetual disapproval. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the clean floors, the warm fire, and Clara, who had risen to her feet. "Elias, darling," she exclaimed, rushing to him and pressing a cold cheek against his. "I was so worried. The first snow, and you all alone out here with those poor motherless boys." Her gaze flicked to Clara, dismissing her as a piece of furniture. "And the hired help, of course." The boys had come to the doorway, their faces wary. Martha descended upon them, enveloping them in hugs they stiffly endured. "Oh, my poor lambs, your Auntie Martha has come to see you." She finally turned her full, venomous attention to Clara. "And you are?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is Clara," Elias said, stepping slightly forward, a protective gesture he was not even aware of. "She is the mistress of this house." Martha's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. "The mistress?" She let out a short, cruel laugh. "Elias, have you lost your mind? What could this plain little thing possibly know about running a house like this? Sarah, bless her soul, would be turning in her grave." Clara's face remained serene. She did not flush or look away. She simply met Martha's cruel gaze with her own steady one. "Your sister's memory is honored in this house, ma'am." Every day, the simple dignity of her words seemed to infuriate Martha more than any angry retort could have. "You will address me as Mrs. Pembroke," she snapped. "And you will fetch my bags from the buggy." "No," Elias said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Martha stared at him, her mouth agape. "What did you say?" "Clara is not a servant," he stated. "If you wish for your bags, you can ask one of the hands. Or you can fetch them yourself." The air crackled with tension, Martha's face contorted with a mixture of shock and fury. She had always held a certain power over Elias, the power of their shared grief for Sarah. She had expected to find a broken man, a chaotic household she could easily step into and take over. Instead, she found order, and she found Clara. "I see," she said, her voice turning to ice. "I see what is happening here. You've let this drifter, worm her way into my sister's home, into her life." She turned on Clara. "You think you can replace her? You, with your mousy hair and your washerwoman's hands?" Before Clara could respond, Leo stepped out from behind the doorframe. He moved to stand beside Clara, a small, defiant soldier. "She's not a nobody," he said, his voice shaking but clear. She makes biscuits better than anyone, and she doesn't scream when Sam has nightmares. It was the first time he had ever defended her. The first time he had ever openly allied himself with her. Clara felt a surge of warmth so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent thank you. Martha looked at her nephew as if he had struck her. The betrayal in her eyes was sharp and real. She had lost her foothold. She turned back to Elias, her last resort. Elias, you cannot be serious about this. Think of your reputation. Think of the boys. What will people in town say? I stopped caring what people say a long time ago, Martha, Elias said, his voice weary. You are welcome to stay the night, because of the snow. But in the morning, you will leave. The declaration was final. Martha stood there, defeated and seething, her plans crumbling around her. She saw the quiet strength in Clara, the new steel in Elias's spine, the unexpected loyalty of the children. She had come to conquer a broken home and instead had found a fortress with this plain, silent woman standing at its heart. The crisis had passed, but the threat lingered. Martha's visit had been a skirmish, not the end of the war. Elias knew it. And as he watched Clara later that evening, calmly setting the table for dinner as if nothing had happened, he felt a fierce protective anger he had not felt in years. Martha had not just insulted a housekeeper, she had attacked his home. She had attacked his family. He realized, with a jolt that went straight to his core, that he now considered Clara a part of that family. The arrangement had become something more. The lines he had drawn so carefully on that first rainy day had been washed away, and he had not even noticed it happening. The realization left him breathless. It left him terrified. And it left him with a certainty as solid as the mountains on the horizon. He would not let anyone, not Martha, not the whole world, harm this woman. The snow melted, and spring arrived with a fierce, desperate green. Life on the ranch fell into a new rhythm, one defined by the quiet partnership between Elias and Clara. But Martha's poison had found fertile ground. When Elias took the wagon into town for supplies, he felt the change. The nods from fellow ranchers were a little cooler. The storekeeper, once friendly, was now curt. He heard the whispers behind his back, saw the sideways glances aimed at him. Martha had been busy. She had painted a picture of a grieving, vulnerable man taken in by a cunning, ambitious woman. She'd hinted that Clara was a woman of low character, that she had trapped him. The town, hungry for gossip to liven up the long winter, had feasted on it. Elias ignored it, his face a mask of stone. But the scorn stung. It was a judgment on him, and worse, a judgment on Clara, who was innocent of everything but quiet competence and kindness. The true test came not from whispers, but from fire. It was a dry, windy afternoon in late summer. A spark from the forge, carried by a sudden gust, landed in a pile of dry hay near the main barn. In minutes, the structure was an inferno. The shouts of the men, the terrified screaming of horses, the roar of the flames, it was chaos. Elias was in the thick of it, working with his men to form a bucket brigade, trying to save the adjacent buildings. They had managed to get most of the animals out, but his prize stallion, Titan, was still trapped in his stall, panicked and kicking at the burning wood. "Leave him, boss," one of his men yelled, pulling at his arm. "The roof is going." "No," Elias roared, shaking him off. Titan had been Sarah's favorite. He couldn't lose him. He plunged into the smoke-filled barn, the heat searing his lungs. He could barely see. A heavy beam, eaten through by the fire, crashed down, blocking the main entrance. He was trapped. He fought his way to Titan's stall, the horse rearing and screaming, his eyes wide with terror. Elias worked frantically at the latch, his hands burning on the hot metal. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket. His vision began to blur. He knew he was not going to make it. Suddenly, a smaller figure was beside him, coughing and gasping. It was Clara. Her hair had come undone, and her face was black with soot. "Elias," she screamed over the roar. "The back wall, there's a weak board." He had forgotten, a repair he'd meant to make. "Get out, Clara! Now!" He yelled, trying to push her away. She ignored him, grabbing a fallen piece of timber and using it as a lever against the boards of the back wall. "Help me!" Seeing the fierce determination in her eyes, the complete lack of fear, he threw his own weight against the boards with her. The wood groaned, splintered, and then gave way. A rush of clean air filled their lungs. "Get the horse," she commanded, her voice raw. Together, they calmed the terrified stallion enough to lead him through the jagged opening. They stumbled out into the open air just as the main roof of the barn collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. They stood there, heaving for breath, their faces scorched, their clothes smoking. The ranch hands stared at them, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had all seen her run into the burning building. They had seen her run towards the danger that they, seasoned men, were running from. Elias looked at Clara. Her dress was torn. There was a burn on her arm, and her face was a mess of soot and sweat. He had never seen anyone more beautiful. In that moment, watching her calm the trembling horse with a gentle hand and a soft voice, his respect, his admiration, his protective instinct, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He loved her. The thought did not frighten him this time. It settled in his soul with the weight and certainty of bedrock. He had built walls to keep the world out, and this quiet, unassuming woman had not torn them down. She had simply walked through them as if they were never there, and had shown him that his heart was not a tomb, but merely an empty house waiting for someone to come home. Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind exhaustion and the stinging pain of their burns. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a black skeleton against the starry sky. But no one had been seriously injured, and the other buildings were safe. The ranch had survived. Clara was in the kitchen, tending to the burn on Elias's forearm. She worked with quiet efficiency, her touch gentle as she applied a cool salve. The house was still, the boys asleep upstairs, exhausted by the day's fear and excitement. That was a foolish thing to do, Elias said, his voice rough. He was not looking at his arm. He was looking at her face, illuminated by the soft lamplight. She paused, her fingers hovering over his skin. She looked up and met his gaze. "Saving what matters is never foolish." "I was talking about you," he clarified. "You could have been killed." "You would have been," she replied simply, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. "I could not let that happen. The boys need their father. Is that the only reason?" He pressed, his voice softer now. A flicker of something vulnerability, uncertainty passed through her eyes before she looked down again, focusing on her task. "This is my home," she whispered. "You are my family. I protect my family." Elias reached out with his good hand and covered hers, stilling her movements. Her skin was warm beneath his. "Clara," he said, the sound of her name filling the quiet room. "I did not expect this." "Expect what?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on their hands. "You," he said. "I did not expect you." He gently turned her hand over in his, examining her calloused palms, the small scars from years of work, the fresh red mark from a burn she had not bothered to tend on herself. This was the hand that had brought order to his home, that had soothed his children, that had pulled him from a fire. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was an act of reverence. She finally looked up at him, her grey eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight. He saw fear in them, but also a dawning hope that mirrored his own. He leaned forward, slowly giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She did not even breathe. He closed the small space between them and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition. It was the silent confession of a man who had thought his heart was dead and had just discovered it was beating stronger than ever. It was the answer to a prayer a woman had been too proud to ever speak aloud. When he pulled back, they simply looked at each other, the truth finally laid bare between them. The arrangement was over. The fire had destroyed the barn, but it had forged something new and unbreakable in its place. Word of Clara's bravery spread through the valley faster than the fire itself. The ranch hands spoke of it with reverence. The story changed in the telling. She became a hero, a figure of quiet legend. The whispers in town began to shift from scorn to grudging respect. But Martha Pembroke was not a woman to be swayed by heroics. She saw Clara's growing esteem not as a victory, but as a threat. Her opportunity came when the circuit judge arrived in town, and she filed a formal petition. She claimed Elias was mentally unstable from grief, that he was being manipulated by an adventuress, and that for the safety and moral upbringing of her sister's children, she should be granted their legal guardianship. It was a declaration of war. A summons was delivered to the ranch. The hearing was to be held in the town hall in 3 days. It was, for all intents and purposes, a public trial. The night before the hearing, a heavy silence fell over the Thorne house. Clara moved through her evening tasks with her usual calm, but Elias could see the fear she tried to hide. It was in the slight tremor of her hands, in the way her gaze kept drifting to the boys as they slept. The thought of losing them, of being cast out again, was a terror she could barely contain. Elias found her on the porch, staring out at the darkened prairie. He came and stood beside her, his presence a solid comfort in the night. "I am afraid," she confessed, her voice a bare whisper. "So am I," he admitted. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "But we will face this together. She will not take them from us. I will not allow it." The town hall was packed. It seemed the entire county had turned out for the spectacle. They sat on hard wooden benches, their faces a sea of curiosity and judgment. Clara sat beside Elias at a table at the front, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her plain dress, her weathered hands, her very existence in this town. Martha was there, dressed in severe black, a picture of bereaved, responsible womanhood. Her lawyer presented her case first, painting a lurid picture of Clara as a conniving vagrant and Elias as a man lost in sorrow, incapable of making sound decisions for his children. He called witnesses who testified to Clara's sudden appearance, to Elias's reclusive nature. It was a tapestry of lies woven from threads of truth. Then Martha took the stand. She spoke of her deep love for her departed sister, her concern for her nephews. Her voice dripped with false piety. "I only want to protect them," she said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, "to raise them in a home free from improper influence." Her gaze flickered towards Clara, leaving no doubt as to her meaning. The crowd murmured. The judge, a stern-faced man with tired eyes, looked from Martha to Elias. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, "do you have a response?" Elias rose to his feet. He was not a man of many words, and the entire room leaned forward, eager to hear what the silent rancher would say. He was not looking at the judge. He was not looking at Martha. His eyes were on Clara. "For 2 years after my wife died," he began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "this town saw me as a grieving widower. A man to be pitied. What you did not see was a man failing his sons. What you did not see was a house that had gone cold and silent, a home that had lost its heart." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then this woman arrived. She came with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a quiet dignity that none of you could ever understand. He turned his gaze to the crowd. You whispered about her. You called her names. You judged what you did not know. While you were whispering, she was mending my son's clothes. She was teaching them their letters. She was sitting with them through nightmares. She faced down their anger not with a harsh word, but with a patience I have never known. He looked directly at Martha now, his eyes like chips of flint. You talk about influence. Let me tell you about her influence. When my barn burned, your improper influence ran into the flames to save my life. While my own men stood back, she ran toward the fire. A hush fell over the room. Many in the crowd had heard the story, but to hear it from Elias Thorne himself gave it a stunning power. Elias turned his back on Martha, on the judge, on the entire town. He walked the few steps to Clara and stood before her. He took both of her hands in his, pulling her gently to her feet. This is not a marriage of convenience, he said, his voice now filled with a raw emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him. This is a marriage of necessity. I need her. My sons need her. Her strength, her kindness, her courage, they are the heart of my home now. They are the heart of my life. He looked down into her eyes, which were shining with unshed tears. She is not my housekeeper, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. She is my wife, in every way that matters, and I love her. He leaned down and kissed her, right there in front of the judge and the gossips and the whole damn town. It was a kiss of ownership, of devotion, a public sealing of the private confession made in the quiet of their kitchen. When he raised his head, the silence in the room was broken by a smattering of applause from the back, where his ranch hands stood. It grew as other townspeople, shamed by his words and moved by his sincerity, joined in. The judge banged his gavel, a small smile playing on his lips. Petition for guardianship is denied, he announced gruffly. Case dismissed. Martha Pembroke sat frozen in her chair, her face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. She had been defeated, publicly and completely. Elias, still holding Clara's hand, led her out of the town hall and into the bright sunlight. They walked through the crowd, which parted for them now with a new respect. They had arrived as objects of scornful curiosity. They left as a family, forged in loss and fire, and now, finally, validated in the eyes of the world. A year later, the Thorne Ranch was thriving. The new barn, built with the help of neighbors who were now friends, was twice the size of the old one. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, of Leo reading aloud to his brother, of Sam's laughter, of the soft hum of Clara's voice as she went about her day. She was no longer the gate watcher. She was Mrs. Thorne, a name she wore with the same quiet dignity with which she had once worn poverty. Elias had proposed to her properly that spring, on the porch where they had stood together in fear. He hadn't offered a fancy ring, but a simple band of gold he had ridden 60 miles to purchase. Their wedding was a simple affair, held under the wide prairie sky, witnessed by the boys and the ranch hands who had become their staunchest allies. Now, as autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and fire, Clara sat on the porch swing, a newborn baby girl bundled in her arms. They had named her Hope. Elias came and sat beside her, his large frame settling gently so as not to rock the swing too much. He looked at his daughter, her tiny face serene in sleep, and then at his wife. The lines of sorrow around her mouth had softened into a gentle smile. Her eyes, once filled with a grim determination to simply survive, now shone with a deep, peaceful contentment. Leo and Sam came thundering onto the porch, stopping just short of the swing. They were taller, their faces losing their boyish roundness, but their eyes were bright with an uncomplicated happiness that had been absent for so long. "Can we show her the foal, Pa?" Leo asked, his voice hushed with reverence for the sleeping baby. "Later," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, Let your mother rest." They nodded and settled onto the top step of the porch. Two young guardians standing watch over their new sister, their new family. Elias slipped his arm around Clara's shoulders, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The wind moved through the hollow stalls of the new barn like breath through a flute. The air smelled of hay and wood smoke and the promise of a cold, clear night. She had come to his gate with nothing, a woman seeking only shelter from the rain. He had been a man walled up in his own grief, seeking only a pair of hands to manage his broken life. He had opened the gate to send her away. Instead, he had let in the world. He had let in the light. He looked at Clara, at the family they had built together from the ashes of their pasts. The arrangement, born of desperation and practicality, had bloomed into a love more sturdy and deeply rooted than any lightning-struck oak. It was a love that didn't need grand declarations. Its proof was in the warm weight of the child in her arms, the loyalty of the sons at their feet, and the peaceful silence of two hearts finally truly at home.